And a very warm welcome to St. Paul's Institute and to this discussion on water politics. I'm not sure if it's a relief or whether it's torture to be thinking of water in this heat, but I think we are actually down here in one of the coolest places in town. Anyway, we're here to think about how water access affects territory, policy, and conflict. And this event is held in collaboration with King's Water, an interdisciplinary programme for the study of water. And my name is Mark Oakley, and I'm the Chancellor here at St. Paul's Cathedral, and I really am very delighted to be able to welcome you here for this very important topic. And tonight's event forms part of this year's JustWater programme. This is an international effort to get churches and cathedrals like ours around the world to raise their voices on issues of water stewardship. And over the last several months, for example, here at St. Paul's, we've had art exhibitions, music, poetry, a sermon series, panel discussions focusing on the vital importance of water for the survival of life, on the spiritual significance of water in many of the world's faiths, on access to clean water and sanitation, and most especially on humanity's role in helping to sustain and preserve access to clean, usable water for humans and animals in the face of increasing use and rapidly evolving climate change. And this evening's event is intended to introduce non-specialists to the impact of water issues on politics, on policy and conflict zones. And humanity's access to usable water has always been, of course, a key and absolute necessary driver of his choice of habitat. From blockades, which have prevented the entry of food and water to cities since biblical times, through to more recent territorial access issues to sources of water, or conflict driven by declining availability of water sources, access to water has long been a critical element in geopolitics. However, you might always not learn that from our media outlets. And as we will learn this evening, water is often an integral driver of politics. All of us, of course, are aware of the US president's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord. And it would be hard to find a more public expression of the politics involved in water and climate change, in this case, his perceived trade-off between domestic economic growth and business profit and responsible action on climate change. Not everything we will hear about this evening, I'm sure, will be quite so obvious, but hopefully what you learn this evening will help us all be more inquiring consumers of news and politics, better understanding the connections between environmental issues around water and all their political consequences. And of course, as you're sitting there, if you have ideas as to other topics that it would be helpful for us to explore with you in this way, do please write down these ideas on your program and leave them with us, or of course, drop us an email. So my only remaining job this evening is to introduce your moderator, Dr. Sarah Dry, who is a science writer and a trustee of the Science Museum, who's currently writing a book about the history of water and climate science. And Sarah will introduce our panelists. But again, from all of us here at the Institute, a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much and welcome everyone. It's great to see you all here, and I have a feeling that one of the things we might learn tonight is that being together is one of the most important steps that we can take in understanding and working towards a world in which water is shared more equitably. So being here is perhaps even more than half the battle in a sense. So we're also very lucky because we have a wonderful group of experts to lead us through an evening of discussion about a subject which is, among other things, certainly incredibly complicated. We've already heard the subtitle of this talk, which is How Water Access Affects Territory, Policy, and Conflict. I don't know exactly what our speakers will address, but I have a feeling that we will be hearing about the nexus of the relationship between water, economics, politics, and climate at the very least, and that's already quite a lot to be getting on with. Water has become recently, and justifiably, I think, a much more prominent role in public discourse. The JustWater initiative is one indication of that. I think my individual choice to write a book on water is part of a kind of zeitgeist. One doesn't realize when one makes a choice like that one is actually riding a wave, as it were, but it's become increasingly clear to me that I am. And one of the things I've learned, and I'm still learning, is humility when it comes to water, because water means so many things to so many people. My own area of research is the history of science, the history of ways in which scientists in particular have thought about water. But one of the things I look forward to learning tonight is ways in which many different kinds of people think about water, and the ways in which we might value those thoughts differently, and what we might want to do about that. So I think that what's interesting in particular about water is that it draws our attention to the ways in which we are connected, but also to the ways in which we're divided. And in this, I think it is truly a global feature, a global topic. As I said, we have the good fortune of having a great panel to lead us through this complicated topic, and I think they will help us perhaps think about some of the right questions to start asking, and maybe even some of the answers. The format of this evening is quite simple. They're each going to speak for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion between the members of the panel. And meanwhile, I hope that you will be thinking of burning questions that you would like to put forward to the panel, and we will have plenty of time to take those at the end of the intra-panel discussion. So that's all I'll say for right now, and it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Naho Muromachi, who is a lecturer in the geography department at King's College, and who leads a wonderful group called King's Water, which is a fantastic research hub on water and environment and development that draws together researchers working in both social and physical sciences. Please help me in welcoming Naho Muromachi.
I'll remain seated, and I'm going to try and use my 10 minutes very effectively. As the first speaker, what I'm going to do is give an overview of why the politics of water matters, when it matters. And in order to do this, I'm going to provide some 3 key points or 3 overview messages. First of all is that many of the water problems that we have today are due to our decisions that we make within society about how we use it, how we allocate it to different sectors, how we allocate it to different uses. The problems of water scarcity are not environmentally determined. Problems of too much water, like flooding, is not the fault of one's nationality or creed, and therefore we have to understand the social, political processes behind the decisions of how we use water, how we access water. The second point that I'm going to try and expand on is to say that cooperating over water to avert these kinds of problems of scarcity, of flooding, of water-related disasters, water-related illnesses, etc., is good, but it might not be enough. We need to understand that just setting up cooperative arrangements, agreements, laws, rules, etc., is definitely the right step forward, but implementing them, getting them to produce the outcomes is the key issue. The third point that I want to make is that water problems need to be solved, discussed in tandem with other issues such as food, such as electricity, power, hydropower, with issues of migration, with issues of urban planning, with issues of geopolitics as well. So just looking within the physical boundaries of the river basin, just looking at where the lakes, for example, lie, is not going to produce a sufficient solution for us. So I'll elaborate these 3 points in order. So my first point is about why water problems are very much the product of our decisions within society. As you may have read in newspapers or radio reports, there's this concern about the threat of water wars, that there are already regions facing water scarcity. This could lead to further political instability. Places like the Middle East quite often are suggested as hotspots of these water-related conflict. The Syrian crisis has been linked to, in the past, to reduced rainfall that has led to farmers having difficulties producing food and therefore leading to conflict. But I question if that's a really robust causation. I question that based on the fact, first, there has been no acute militarized war between states, even though we have over 270 internationally shared river basins. We also have a track record for developing global policy that discusses how we can use our water more sustainably, how we can develop various global initiatives to look after the environment. So perhaps this notion of water war might be very exaggerated, but still the competition for water between farmers, between communities is real. We can't avoid that. It is real. But it's not so much about the quantity of water available in a river or available in a lake that automatically causes this competition over water. If, for example, people have the financial resources, if they have the various monetary resources, they can get access to water even if there is overall limited amount of water in a river. And usually it's the poor who end up having a worse off deal, that they would have to pay more to access the water, or they pay it in different ways, for example, through time, that they have to spend much more time in fetching the water. And I think this is where we need to focus our attention to, rather than these exaggerated claims about water wars or water hotspots. So the key point here is, how does social marginalization, how do these competition between communities, between individuals, and also competition between states that share rivers manifest in the access and allocation inequities of water? The second point that I'm going to move on to is to think about, well, how can we solve this imbalance? For example, having treaties is a good idea between countries, have a bilateral or a multilateral treaty to think about the sustainable use of the water. Many national governments are reforming their water policy so that they can have robust legislative measures in place. All of these, as I mentioned, are steps in the right direction, but the key point is that much of the times, the case studies that I've seen, is in the challenges in how do you get these treaties to work? How do you get these laws and regulations to work over the long term? Quite often they end up being paper tigers. They might not produce the kinds of outputs, the outcomes that we would like. At the global level, it's great that water is being featured in various debates around sustainable development goals, for example, and there is a lot of political interest in it. But the question of how do we really put these into exercise, how do we really make a better institutional setting is the key. And so just counting the number of agreements, counting the number of technical committees, just counting the number of initiatives that raise the importance of water might not be sufficient. That's just the first step, but we need to go the further step. And the further step, I would argue, is to think about the power differences, the power asymmetries that are involved in making these decisions. For example, if we look at rivers that are shared by different nations, there is inevitably going to be power differences. And therefore, those who have more political power at the negotiation table can set terms of agreements that are more favorable to them, or they might purposely ignore certain points of water management that might be inconvenient to those that are powerful. And so we need to understand how these power asymmetries ultimately manifest in these agreements, in these regulatory measures, etc. Much of my research in the developing world shows that quite often there are agreements, there is positive political will to do something about the sustainability of their rivers, but it's a situation of shallow conflict and cooperation in the sense that there is some sort of contention over water between governments that are sharing these big rivers. There is awareness that if the water is used well, it could power economic development, it could produce energy, it could promote agricultural productivity through further irrigation, it can sustain the urban sector with more water for industry, etc. But getting these agreements to work in the long term becomes quite problematic, and therefore we have a situation of shallow conflict and cooperation. So my third point then, I think, is to say how can we better understand water in tandem with these other issues of energy, of food production, of urban development, etc., of industrial development, etc. And this is where I think understanding the political economy of water is very useful. A short example that I can give is the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia. This river is shared by the Yunnan province in China with Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. So 6 countries share this major river. A lot of irrigation activities have occurred over the last 50 years, and now we're seeing a hydropower boom. And there's a series of dams that are being planned on both the mainstream and also on the tributaries. Now, on one hand, that's great because there's a lot of energy demand, and there are arguments that hydropower could promote this energy security. But on the other hand, there are very serious concerns about downstream implications to the ecology, and also as a related concern, how livelihoods of people are going to be affected. People are very much reliant on the river for fishing, for irrigation. How is that going to affect their livelihoods? So the case of the Mekong can not just be examined through looking at where the dams are going to be developed, but also requires a wider lens, a wider perspective of why is energy being pursued. This is in relationship to, for example, hydropower being seen as a clean form of energy in this era of climate adaptation, climate mitigation. There are also issues about urbanization. A lot of the energy is going to places where there are big mega cities springing up, and that there's a growing middle class that are demanding certain types of lifestyle choices. And so looking at water in the Mekong region, trying to solve the issue of dams is not just about where river can be better placed, it's also about energy use, about urban uses. It's also about the migration of flows and capital between different countries and different places. So the last sort of concluding comment that I would make is that I'm sure my fellow colleagues will speak to, but we need to better understand how water is valued, quite often how water can end up being commodified, and how society can rethink about the choices that we make and how we access and use our water. Thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tony Allen, who is Professor Emeritus at King's College London.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Water is political. Power is political. Some of you will have heard the aphorism of the wonderful American journalist who wrote about water in the 1980s. He said, "Water flows uphill to money and power." It's a very powerful idea. So we know that water flows downhill, but politics can make it flow uphill. If you have a lot of power, you can invest and pump, and you can have the water. He also said, I find even more tellingly, from his observation, looking at how they'd mismanaged and managed water in the west of the United States, he said, economics are fantasy, politics are real. So I'm persuaded that we're onto a political topic. And I just want to do a few things this evening. I'm going to tell you a few ideas about the water that you haven't thought about before. I'd like you to go away this evening with a different perspective on water, and especially a perspective which includes water embedded in food, because 92%, roughly, of the water that we consume every day or every lifetime is embedded in our food. So the people that produce the food, the farmers, must have a very important role in that, but you've never thought of that before. I will mention it again later on. And I'll draw attention to the fact that we have hydrological systems and we have economic systems. The food supply chain, in which 92% of the water is embedded, I will draw attention to that and want you to go away aware of your role in that food supply chain as consumers. And as wonderful, diligent and sensible consumers, you throw 30% of your food away. So if you throw that back at the farmers, it doesn't sound to be a very good system that we have. So there are two streams here. There's this stream here, which is the food supply chain, and this is the hydrology underneath. What we're trying to show in this is how much water goes onto the farm and is then embedded in the food that goes into the manufacturing and the processing and the retailing and so on, and is consumed by us in this part. The vast majority of the water is green water, which you've never thought about. It's the water in the field that is a result of rainfall. It's the majority water. 70% of our food is produced with that water. The blue water, which is also used on the farm, is like the green water, transpired into the atmosphere. We're going to hear about the atmosphere next. But we can see how large the volumes are compared with the volume of water which keeps this sector of the food supply chain going. It's about between 1% and 2% of the water is in that part of the food supply chain. And very little, of course, is involved in the consumption here. But the consumption of water that we care about in our showers and in our having water at home and so on is this water here, the industry water and the domestic water. So the message to go from this evening is we do need the 4%, we need the 8%, we need the 4% for industry, we need the 4% for domestic use and consumption, but most of that can be recovered as sort of dirty water that can be put back. So remember the 92%. I've divided that into three parts. We've got the mode 1 here, which is on the farm, where 92% of the water is, but none of it is, or very little of it is, accounted for. We have in the room this evening Chris Perry, he helps us a great deal with thinking about the water accounting, and he knows as well as anyone that we do not, in fact, include the cost of that water and the cost of making it dirty in the price of our food. So this is a failed market, in effect, because we can only make sure that the farmers have a living if we subsidize them. This part is not a perfect market, but it works very well. All the inputs are accounted for. The corporations pay taxes, so it looks as if it's part of a normal market. But the third part, where the consumption is also a version of a failed market. So please keep those ideas in mind. Failed market at the beginning, a relatively effective market in the middle, and another failed market at the end. Just to get an idea of how important water and food, making sure that food is available, the politicians throughout the world know that it is essential that there's food on the shelves tomorrow and next week. If there was to be any sign that there would not be food on the shelves next week, the people on the streets in every country in the world would be extraordinary. We have a system, clearly, which works rather well, but it's there in a system in which we do not value all the inputs, and I'll explain the importance of that in a moment. Now, how have we done over the past years? This is from from about 1950 through to 2010 or so, and we can see that we have, in fact, in rich countries, managed to make sure that we have enough water. This is what we need. And in the world, it's been good, and in Asia, it's been good. In Africa, south of the Sahara, it's been not so good. And we've also had these extraordinary increases in the production of food per acre. That's mainly on rain-fed farming since 1945-50. So there have been some wonderful technological things happening. The farmers have used those technologies and their capacity to make sure that there is food on the shelves. Now, we have been talking about conflict. My understanding of the situation is that because we can trade food, this is a diagram which shows the economies on the left-hand side. This is North America, South America, Australia, Eastern Europe, that's Russia and Ukraine, and over here we've got Middle East and Africa, Asia, and Europe. And you can see that every bit of the histograms is 5 years, so you can see that the United States has been doing proud things for the world by making sure that the deficit countries do in fact have enough food. South America is the place where the world is going to be saved because we have that trend. Australia has very few people, not much water, but enough to export a lot of food. This dramatic change since 1992 or 1990s is quite interesting, that Eastern Europe is now a very significant player in the international system. Now, because you can import food, it takes 1,000 tons of water to grow a ton of wheat. It takes 16,000 to produce a ton of beef. If you can import those things, and if the countries that export them are happy to export their environments, and they are, the United States does it quite happily. So the United States is exporting not only food, but also its own water environments. So that's why we don't have water wars, because the food that is exported is successfully exported and is often at half cost. So we then come on to talk about price. Did you know that the price of food has been falling for a couple of hundred years? This is a diagram from FAO, and you can see how since 1961 the real price of food has been going down. We've had a recent price spike, but when the next 2 or 3 slides you'll see that that's not such a frightening thing. The shelf prices are here, and the yellow is the price, which is the real price as a result of taking into account subsidies and so on. So that's the FAO version. The USDA, US Department of Agriculture version is here, and you can see this 1%. It's from 1900 in this case, and that was the 70s price spikes, the current price spikes here, and the 1% fall in price, and of course the population doing this. Then we've got the OECD version, and I was very sad to see how the economists in 2007, 2011 said we were in a new world of, a new normal was to be volatile prices. They hadn't, in fact, looked back at this version of the story here, which is where we've got these price spikes in the 70s. I remember these, it was in the middle of my career, and I thought that, great, we're going to have the prices doing this. But a friend at LSE said, no, the forces in the system are to take it down, and in fact, we're down again. This one predicts that by 2050, we'll be in the same position. This is a modeled idea. And just, I couldn't resist putting this one up. This is food prices in the UK, wheat, or in England rather, from 1264. And this is the Industrial Revolution. So our food price falling is something which we've only enjoyed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we need these ideas in place. There is something happening, and we need to understand it to help the politicians do the right thing. Very quickly, who will save the world? Well, if you think about that food supply chain, it has an awful lot of agents in it, farmers all the way through to consumers, and they're just all given the same weight, as it were. But if you give them the current position and who has power, you can see that I argue that the farmers have very little power, but should have a lot of power because they're doing what we want them to do, grow food, but we don't give them the price because the prices are going down. I haven't got the time to give all the nuance on that, but the prices are going down. We're not charging for the full price of food. The corporates are rather powerful. The state is very powerful, but we don't give it the signals we should as consumers to make sure that we do the right thing. So consumers at the bottom, those of us in the room, we need to understand that we need to do the right thing. So this is how it should be. Farmers with a lot of power, consumers sending the right signals to the politicians to do the right thing, to make sure that we have well-stewarded farms with water, ecosystems, biodiversity, all being looked after carefully. Just to make it, put it into the context of real politics, this is from 100 years ago. What we should do with food, all consistent with what I've just been talking about: buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, serve just enough, use what is left. So I throw it back to you. Please give the politicians space to help the farmers do the right thing for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Declan Conway, who is a professorial research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics.
Thank you. Oh, I've lost my text. That's very odd. Okay. Well, perhaps I shouldn't have used slides anyway. I'm not quite sure what's happened there, but my talk is on climate change and water security. I mean by climate change the effects of human activities leading to the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, leading to a change in the global climate, global warming, and also regional changes to not only temperature but other important variables that affect the hydrological cycle, particularly precipitation. And I'm also talking around the idea of water security, and by water security, I'm interested in ideas about ensuring a reliable water supply of an acceptable quality to society for uses, but also protection of people against hazards such as, water-related hazards such as floods. So my title, were it up there, is Climate Change and Water Security. So to start the presentation, I thought I'd go back a little bit to the hydrological cycle and to situate that within a river basin situation. Now, at the top of the slide, we have, as global climate change occurs, global warming occurs, we are seeing and we will continue to see changes in critical variables such as rainfall and the evaporation or the evapotranspiration, the loss of water from the land surface, sometimes known as green water flow. So we have changes in rainfall patterns and we have changes in evaporation. Changes in rainfall can be change in the mean rainfall. It may get wetter, it may get drier, but particularly we're concerned about changes in the extremes and the variability of rainfall, which will create challenges for effective management of water. As the surface of the planet warms, we expect to see greater levels of evaporation, but exactly to the extent that increases, we're not fully sure about at the moment. So the changes in climate will drive changes in water availability at the river basin scale. And that's the challenge that we face in terms of water security. It is it's the availability of water resources. So particularly effects on surface water, on river flows, on the amount of water which recharges groundwater, and we're also concerned about the direct effects of climate on land cover. So as temperature changes, as rainfall changes, we will see shifts in vegetation patterns, which can have knock-on effects for the river flows in river basins. We're also concerned, of course, about sea level rise with global climate change, but I won't talk too much about that. So that's the problem that we're facing. The thing about showing the catchment or the river basin that I wanted to emphasize is the fact that we have a physical system, the hydrological cycle, but we have a social and economic and political system which is deeply immersed in that. We have different users of water in the river basin, farmers for irrigation, domestic users in urban situations for drinking water, and so on and so forth. So we have different pressures on the use of water through demand from different sectors within society. I wanted to highlight some of the implications through using an example of the Nile River, which is people will often refer to in the context of water and conflict, or the potential for wars over water, as it is a very interesting case study. There have been issues over water availability and efficient management of water going back many centuries, going back thousands of years into ancient Egyptian times, and to highlight the long-term challenge that water availability has presented to us, I've used a time series which shows measurements of the annual flow of the Nile River. Now, much of the water in the Nile comes from upstream countries in the Ethiopian Highlands, in the East African Rift Valley lakes, Lake Victoria particularly, and those rivers drain humid areas and they flow into semi-arid areas in Sudan and into Egypt, and Egypt is highly reliant on the Nile waters for its fresh water, for about 95% of its fresh water use. So the series here shows you over time from the 1870s up to the early 2000s the annual flow of the Nile River as it enters Egypt in the individual bars there, and then the bold line shows the moving average of the annual flows. So we see from that there has been long-term variability in the flows. So for example, prior to the 1900s, there was a humid period. We had high water flows within the Nile Basin. through much of the 20th century, quite a stable period of, a median level of flows. But during the 1980s into the early 1990s, we saw a period of very low rainfall leading to low river flows. And that period brought Egypt very close to a major water supply crisis in 1987, 1988 that was only really alleviated by a major flood in the year of 1988. So this shows us that historically we have seen high levels of variability within the hydrological cycle, but it also highlights the significance of that variability for the effective management of water resources. And when we get sequences of dry years or wet years, it creates problems for the management of water, and it creates problems for the allocation of water between countries or between sectors which are using that water. So what can we say about future climate change? Well, we have tools which are known as climate models, which are similar to weather forecasting models, but rather than running the models for 3-4 days into the future, we run the models for 5, 10, or 100 years into the future, and we change the atmosphere in the model to reflect the changing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through emissions and burning of fossil fuels. We then look at those climate models, and they give us some information about the way the climate will change in different parts of the world. And in particular, we can look at the way river basins may change in terms of their water availability. What we find for the Nile is that most of the model projections for the future from the climate models suggest moderate increases in rainfall and river flows. So we may see slightly higher flows in the future, but some models project into the future drier conditions, and other models project wetter conditions. But what we can say that all the models agree is that we're likely to see much higher levels of variability in the flows. So the frequency and intensity of wet years and dry years will increase in the future, and that will create problems for effective management of water resources. So my last slide then is just to highlight a few of the specific management challenges that we face within the Nile Basin. So the map shows you the outline of the Nile system, the source areas here, Ethiopian Highlands, down here in the Rift Valley, and East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. So 3 of the key challenges from climate change in terms of the Nile Basin are, particularly this is Egypt here, so the water is coming from the humid areas flowing into the dry areas. Egypt is highly vulnerable to fluctuations in the river flows, the availability of water, and the threat of changes in that will create stresses for the management of water within the country. And then secondly, my text has disappeared there, but that's pointing out the Ethiopian Highlands, which generate a lot of the water that flows into the Nile, about 70% of it. Ethiopia has historically not used much of the Nile waters. It's now building a very large dam just inside the border with Sudan and Ethiopia. That dam is going to hold back water to generate hydropower, and the management of the releases from that dam will have significant consequences for Egypt downstream. And then my third point to note is the issue of Lake Victoria, the White Nile system in East Africa shared between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. So historically, that's seen major flood events, which have had significant consequences for flooding of infrastructure around the lake. They've also disrupted hydropower. So the threat of changes in lake level and lake outflows and their impacts on infrastructure and on hydropower generation represent a significant management challenge. And the final point really to note about this, of course, is that all these changes are occurring within a shared river basin, 10 or 11 countries sharing the water within the basin, much of the water being used for agriculture, a lot of it supporting hydropower generation. And the challenge will be dealing with both the physical consequences of changes in variability in the flows, but particularly the political implications of how different countries can organize themselves to cooperate and manage those changes in variability and water availability that will occur in the future. And there is no doubt that with the ongoing developments in the basin, that we need to see an increasing cooperation around water in terms of its allocation and in terms of the management of dams and reservoirs within the basin. And that's it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Declan. Now for our final speaker, Terry Fuller, who is the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, and has nearly 30 years experience as a river and coastal flood risk manager. So we have a practitioner in the house.
Indeed, thank you. And that leads very nicely into the particular theme I want to concentrate around now, which is to look at solutions and potential solutions to prevent future conflict occurring and maybe even alleviate current conflict. Now, I appreciate you've been sitting and listening for quite some time, so I'm actually going to give you what my answer is to global water security now and in one word, and that word is cooperation. Now, that might seem a little simplistic. It might even seem to be a bit of a fanciful notion, but actually, I think that cooperation between nations is wholly possible. And not only that, I'd contest further than that, actually, that water scarcity can actually be a catalyst for cooperation between nations and not a source of conflict. And I'll actually finish with some examples that point towards that brighter outlook. Okay. First of all, though, I just want to draw your attention to this image here. This image was taken from my organisation's annual environmental photographic competition, and this image won the Climate Change Prize. And it shows life jackets that have been discarded on the Greek island of Lesbos following exodus of people from Syria just recently. And this image has had a profound effect on me and my colleagues in my organisation, because we very much saw this as a tap on the shoulder to the sorts of migration issues that we foresee if we don't get water security right. And actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the conflict in Syria, although born out of a lot of complex issues, was actually exacerbated and, in some respects, amplified by water scarcity issues. So in a nutshell, this is just the outline of the little journey I'd like to take you on over the next 8 minutes or so. Okay, I'm going to just start really with acknowledging what I think are the three primary pressures creating water stress, and that is climate change, rising population, and poor water management. And it's the third of those that I want to concentrate on now. I'm actually going to look at poor water management in terms of highlighting some examples of bad practice, because I think it's important to understand that. To look at some of the practical aims that I think we need to adopt, and then to get to my opening point really about how we can achieve regional, global and international cooperation. So examples of bad practice. Well, I think to begin to understand the ways that we can solve the water crisis, we need to understand the types of problems that not only are we facing, but those that we are creating. Some of the previous speakers have talked very much about that aspect of things. And I'm going to highlight now what I believe is one of the biggest global issues, and that is groundwater. We've seen a rapid depletion in almost all of the major aquifers in the arid and semi-arid parts of the world. And unfortunately, groundwater is seen as a bit of a saviour from drought, and that digging more boreholes can buy us out of that. But that's only a short-term fix. In addition, we've seen where competing demands for water are being met through abstraction from aquifers, from groundwater sources. For example, production in energy in America prompted drilling of 40,000 wells, of which more than half were in areas already stricken by drought. This type of practice is leaving the world's groundwater seriously depleted, and in some cases irrecoverably so. So in the 7 years from 2003, parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran lost a volume of fresh water equivalent to the amount of water in the Dead Sea. And 60% of that was a reduction in groundwater reserves. This for me is just one example of bad planning, grasping hold of short-term fixes and a lack of joined-up thinking. So moving along, what of good practice or better practice? Well, I think there are 4 practical aims that we need to establish. The first one is, obviously, use water more wisely, right across all of its uses. Secondly, eliminate the amount of wastewater we generate and treat the wastewater that we do generate as a resource, not as a product that needs to just be gotten rid of. Thirdly, we need to strengthen local drought resilience measures and have measures in place to do that. And fourthly, and this chimes back to the second speaker, improving the efficiency of our use of water for agricultural purposes. Those would be my 4 practical aims. Now, in the preparation for this evening, I was asked to just address privatisation. And I don't want to get overly political about this, but I will just sort of talk briefly about some of the global context of privatisation, in that in the 1990s, global institutions like the World Bank and the World Health Organization promoted private involvement in water supply as a way of resolving water crises in developing countries. Now, that preference, along with an historic failure, prompted the Indian government in its national water policy to actually adopt a policy of private sector participation. And the expected benefits of that privatisation was that it would bring innovation and finance and good management practices, etc. Now, some years on, for some, that may well be true. And there may be evidence that those benefits have been brought to bear. But for the poorest in Indian society who cannot afford to pay for water, they do not have sufficient access to clean water. Elsewhere in the world, there are many examples of mixed success and failure in private ownership. Probably the most notable in recent decades was the Cochabamba water war in Bolivia, which saw tens of thousands of people marching against water prices, and one person was actually killed in that march. The UK, we have a better story to tell, arguably. Here the industry is regulated, and most of the water companies have introduced social tariffs, for example. So whether you support privatisation or not, my key message here is that it does need to be regulated, and in such a way that no section of society is precluded from having access to clean water regardless of their ability to pay. And that's all I want to say on privatisation. The next theme I just wanted to pick up on in terms of good management is about data. A significant starting point of good practice is to make use of and share the great wealth of data and technology available to us to understand the status and distribution of water resources. So, for example, it's now possible to detect the status and changes in the condition of groundwater reserves from satellites orbiting 400 kilometres above the Earth's surface. There are also examples of cutting-edge tools such as the India Water Tool, which is an online portal giving access to large amounts of data, predictions, forecasts, analysis, etc. And so to the final part of this quick journey I'm taking you through in terms of how do we achieve the cooperation that is so essential for us to put good practices into place. Well, I'll start with a couple of good regional examples. First of all, let's go to California. California was facing an epic drought in 2014 following years of water stress. The solution that they came up with was a statewide leadership and cooperation between regions who were working to common objectives, but in a way that recognised regional differences. I think that was a really important part of its success. In the UK, there are cooperatives between water companies, for example, Water Resources South East. So here the individual water companies work to a regional strategy. And provisional findings are showing that by constructing appropriate transfer infrastructure, the combined development costs were reduced by about £500 million, which is money that can be reinvested into further good practices. But what of global international cooperation? The above examples are just regional and intranational. Well, I think if you take the type of principles that I've been describing and apply these globally, then it starts to get really exciting. Water scarcity really can be a force that binds people into cooperation and not conflict. So how? Well, 3/4 of the United Nations member states share river or lake basins with their neighbours, and these serve 40% of the world's population. So it's imperative that nations do cooperate to ensure that water is shared equitably and used sustainably. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, some 287 international water agreements were actually signed, and some of these have really stood severe tests. For example, the Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan has survived 3 wars between the two countries. Now, in March last year, the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes became available for all UN member states. So this creates an opportunity to create a global framework for preventative diplomacy to deal with transboundary water issues. But I think the real key point here, and this has been touched on by some of the previous speakers, is that such cooperations must be founded upon mutual benefits. And we heard in the previous presentation about the Grand Renaissance Dam in the upper reaches of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, which I think is actually an example of this, or at least potentially. So here we have a project that's been a major source of concern for Egypt at the downstream end of the Blue Nile. Such was this concern that the former Egyptian government vowed to protect its historical rights to the river at any cost. And according to a WikiLeaks post 5 years ago, a military response was under consideration, including an air raid. Recently, though, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan have signed a mutual no-harm agreement, which is significant given some of the competing interests involved here. So, for example, the primary purpose of that dam for Ethiopia is to generate electricity. And so they're keen to bring this into operation quickly. And they look to start filling this dam up at the end of this year. And it could take anywhere between 5 and 15 years to actually fill it with water. On the other hand, Egypt are very concerned about the amount of water that's allowed to pass and continue downstream because they depend on it so much. But herein, I think, lies a potential benefit for Egypt. If the operation of the dam is run well, and there is agreement in place which guarantees a minimum annual release, then the dam can actually provide Egypt with a more reliable flow from the Blue Nile, giving protection from drought conditions and safeguard against flood. And you saw some of the variabilities in the previous slides. So here, an understanding of the mutual needs and benefits is a bedrock of cooperation. So I'm going to conclude now with, those are my sort of takeaway messages. I won't read through them, I'll leave them up there for you to look at. What I would say is, if you're interested in reading a bit more into the things I've been talking about, I've prepared this little reading list here. There's copies available at the front, and you're free to take one of these away with you, and it gives some references and some sort of further reading that you can do around the topic. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Well, thank you, panelists. You said some things that resonated, I think, with each other, and I think perhaps also some things with which you may want to disagree, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of both. Certainly the word cooperation came up a couple times. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think that's a word that covers a multitude of evils potentially, or the devil is in the details, I think, on that one. But I'm going to use my prerogative as chair to ask a question on a topic that I'm interested in, which is to press a little bit more on the role of science and engineering in this, because I think we've heard some different perspectives on the extent to which problems about water are problems either caused by or which can be addressed using the tools of science and technology, within which obviously engineering and dams is a major case. But I think also in Tony's remarks, we heard about the capacity to produce food cheaply, which has masked a lot of the inequalities, global inequalities around water. And I wonder, Tony, if you could talk a little bit, maybe initially, about what you see. I mean, I'm assuming the Green Revolution was sort of embedded in some of your slides, this massive growth in food production, thanks in part to new scientific tools post-war. And I'm just wondering what you see the role of, or the potential of further, we might say, techno-scientific solutions to this problem. I have a feeling what your answer might comprise, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And then I think if the other panel members want to reflect upon the extent to which expertise or solutions coming out of science and engineering are, how big a part they're going to play, because I think what's come through very clearly is that this is a question that solving. Sorry? I'm just about to finish, thank you. I just wanted to say that I think it's clear that water politics are political, they're to do with economics, and we've been cautioned not to take science and technology to be the only solution, but I'm wondering how the panelists see that as a part of the solution.
Thank you. Yeah, technology and engineering and science have played an important role. In my lifetime, the population of the world has trebled. We have not had any significant wars over food or water, so something good has been happening. Whenever an agency such as FAO or IFPRI, another agency that looks at food internationally, and these experts come together, they all feel that it's, provided we do a lot of other things, such as not wasting food and doing some of the things that I was talking about, then it is going to be possible to meet the water needs. At the same time, I don't like us to lose sight of the fact that we've had an awful lot of discussion about the Nile and Egypt. The Nile Basin has it used to just have about 70 or 80 million people in it. It's now got 300 million people in it, and it's going to have 600 million people in it. It's already importing, all the sub-Saharan African countries are food importers, and Egypt is only keeping itself in place by importing half its food. So none of the talk here has been about that, but the way the water deficit countries in the world manage their food and water deficit is by trading. So that was the food supply chain, which I was talking about, terribly important. It is normal to be a food importer, a net food importer. 160 countries out of 210 or 20 are net food importers, including all the countries of Europe apart from France, and all the countries of the Middle East. That's 50 out of the quarter of the population. So it's normal, but it's not understood. So so we must have more and more good technology. For the Green Revolution was a good example of making good use of water. It wouldn't have been possible to intensify in the way that the farmers did without the water. So there was a substantial increase in the use of irrigation water, and that was very important. So, but we know, and we've had a reference to the place where humans go to make sure that they've got enough food is to groundwater. And everywhere you irrigate, you always run out of water. California, Texas, North China Plain, Punjab, Australia, the Middle East. So we've got to back off that water which has saved us so far. And technology doesn't do that. Technology can help to use it a bit better. It's regulation that does it. So yes, my answer to your question is technology is useful. But we've, as it were, one of the things that happened in the 90s was that we'd had so much technology that it was called the hydraulic mission. That is, let's have another dam, let's have another more investment in the technology. And unfortunately, the debate swung, the pendulum swung too far the other way, and we're now in a phase where we are thinking about introducing investment to have good technology that will help us to use the water more carefully. But my experience is that technology doesn't regulate, it's politics that regulate, which is why we're talking about it now.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to?
I'll just make a quick comment to say that I have nothing against engineers, just to begin with. So the idea, the reason why perhaps there's a caution against seeing water problems as a technical issue or an issue that can be resolved through engineering solutions is that there has already been a history of trying to implant solutions that have worked in one part of the world to another. But that doesn't necessarily work. And so we see a lot of efforts by US engineers or Dutch engineers who have tried to replicate things that have worked in their home countries to other regions in the world. And that hasn't always fit with the political culture, the decision-making culture of that location. So my sort of slight concern is that by just providing a facade of water problems as one related to science or one related to engineering, we can be sort of tempted to universalize these problems and then lose the local, very, very sort of textualized issues, the culturally, the socioeconomically textured problems. And I think that's where some of my research has pointed to as being something quite nuanced, but very, very important.
Did you want to add anything?
Oh, just very quickly, I mean, I completely agree with that, and I am an engineer, no offence has been taken. Yeah, I don't think it's the biggest influencing factor, although there is plenty of work to develop new technologies, and that does need to continue. I suppose, for me, the technologies we have to treat wastewater are probably the most exciting developments there. And I talked in my presentation about treating wastewater as a resource. By that I mean it has within it things that can be harvested and used and are actually of value. So it's about valuing wastewater and having the technologies to be able to extract those elements and reuse them.
Sarah, can I just...
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Declan.
I wanted to say that I think that science and technology will probably be quite an important part of many of the solutions, but that science and engineering really doesn't operate in a vacuum. And whilst we've seen some incredible successes in terms of global production and particularly around food, there have been very significant environmental externalities or consequences of that success. Now, I think that we're reaching a point where in global development, where the Earth has been, or the state that we're in has been termed the Anthropocene, to reflect the fact that human activities are now dominating many global processes. And what that means is that the buffering capacity of the Earth to absorb some of the externalities is no longer there, and we will be forced to recognize the global or regional consequences of increasing resource use in different areas.
Great, thank you. Well, I think it's definitely time to open the floor up for questions. So I see someone back there in the middle row. I think Barbara's going to come around with the microphone, so if you don't mind waiting.
Thank you very much, David Dewhurst. I've read that rainfall only operates due to evaporation from the sea up to about 400 miles into a continent, and thereafter the water in the atmosphere is from transpiration from forests, trees mainly. What scope is there to increase water resources by developing more forestry or reducing the depredations on forests, especially given that it's going to be the country before the one that gets the rainfall, which will have to provide the trees if this is true?
Anyone want to take that?
I can have a go. It's not close to my area of expertise, but there is a term which people are increasingly using, which is called atmospheric rivers, which is recognizing the movement of moisture and the source of that moisture and where the moisture ends up. And of course, decisions about land use, the role of forest, natural vegetation, the role of irrigated agricultural land and so on will have an effect on moisture transfer in different directions. It depends where you are in the world, how important those processes are. With more evidence, with the use of satellites, with the use of models and so on, we're now increasingly able to track where the moisture is coming from and where it's going. So we can now begin to quantify much better than we have been able to do in the past where it's coming from and the effects if we do change land use. So I think we'll get a much better understanding of those processes, which hopefully will inform decision making and recognition of some of those interconnections.
Great. Question over here on the left, second row. You don't have to stand up, but if you could hold the microphone close to your mouth, then we'll hear you.
No problem. Okay, so you said that engineering and science will be really key in tackling the water issue. Do you think that some governments, in taking this on, they will then justify perhaps the privatization of water and charging higher prices, basically saying that the money is needed for funding these engineering and science sort of schemes? I hope you understand.
Could you repeat the question? Repeat it, because not the audience did.
All right. Okay, so I know that you guys said that science and engineering will play a critical part in tackling the water crisis that many countries are facing. Do you think that some governments in tackling it may choose to privatize their water supply in order to fund these engineering schemes and then perhaps justify charging higher prices and thereby isolating some sects of the society, those who don't have the money to afford? Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
I'll respond to that if I can. Yeah, I mean, certainly privatisation is a commercial venture, so it drives all sorts of behaviours around making profits and finding money for using for other things, etc. Of course, that's part of its strength and potentially weakness. My key point when I looked into privatisation for this evening was that it needs to be regulated such that social equality is not something which is allowed to be a victim of the commercial drivers in a privatised regime. If we allow that to happen, I think there will be conflict. People will rise up against it, and the so-called water wars in Cochabamba sort of 10 or more years ago are an extremely good example of that. The price just got too high, and tens of thousands of people came out into the streets and said, we're not putting up with this anymore. So there is definitely a balance there, but for me, that is an important element of a privatised regime.
Could I add?
Of course, yeah, go ahead, Naho.
I think there's another element of private sector involvement in water management, which is, for example, in the development of dams. A lot of the times, the dams that are being created in developing countries are not funded by national governments, by private investors. And here, I think there is a very unclear, very non-transparent system that is at play. There's, discussion that in the Mekong River Basin that I mentioned in my my presentation, that you can already start making money without even having to have a single drop of concrete go into the river to make the basin, because there is so much financial products that are being produced to allow for electricity trade, and these financial products that derive from this major, massive infrastructure project has definitely a private sector dimension, which then has long-term implications to the ecology, that has long-term implications to the livelihoods of those very much directly reliant on the river resources itself. So I would argue that this aspect of private sector involvement is not just in water provision in large cities or peri-urban areas, it's also in these hidden areas of irrigation development, dam development, etc.
There's a question over here on the right, and then we'll come to you on the left.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Continuing on the theme of science and engineering, a new methodology has been developed to, condense water in the same way that air conditioners condense water vapor into drinking water. Now, if this was scaled up, and taken to humid inland regions with groundwater, where groundwater is in short supply, such as the Punjab and Rwanda, do you think it can be scaled up in such a way that's ecologically sustainable? The Punjab and Rwanda, for example, have seasonal rain. The Punjab experiences monsoon rain once a year, so maybe the water's coming from outside of the region. But Rwanda, I think, is using its own water in the wet seasons.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in. I don't know. I don't have sort of knowledge of the numbers and how practical that actually is in terms of being able to meet the demand needs in that region. But what I would say is we often talk about the water, food and energy nexus, which recognises the interdependency there are between those three particular challenges. And we've heard about food, we've had some mention of energy. And technologies like the one you're describing there, along with desalination, for example, which is also seen as a saviour in certain parts of the world, are highly energy intensive. So we've really got to look in terms of how we crack our energy challenges as much as water, and if we're to be actually relying on those sorts of technologies. I'm not sure it's something that we should be relying upon instead of better practice in managing the water that we do have.
Tony, did you want to?
Yeah. I was wanting us to go away this evening aware that it is easy to provide the 8%. There are some fancy technologies which might, in marginal environments, make it possible for people to survive. But Singapore only has 5% of the water it needs. That's the water that it has to devote to the 8% which it needs for jobs and drinking and industrial water. It imports all its food. So can we get our heads around the idea that it is all you need to provide the 4% plus the 4% is some money, some engineers who can do it, put it in place, some regulation, and the technology. So we know we've got the technologies. The reason we haven't got everyone with safe and secure water is that we can't put these four issues together. So we know we can do the 8%, so can we just take away and remember that it's the 92% which we're not sure about. Everyone pretty well pays for the water they have at home unwillingly, and we have welfare systems to make sure in this country that they can have their water despite not being able to pay. But the food water is the water that we really are not sure about. We're not sure whether there's going to be enough.
I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to use the prerogative of the microphone as opposed to the prerogative of the chair, because I had a question on just this, which is that there's an argument that often happens on the shelves of Waitrose do you buy the pea pods from Kenya? Do you buy, should these countries be using water to feed us? And I don't know how to think about that, because there's part of you that, if you use a development economics logic, says, we are helping those people out of poverty, we're giving them a livelihood, but we're also taking water away from subsistence farmers, often with bribes, that get those big ag companies the water they need. And how does the consumer sitting here, shopping wherever they shop, whether it's Aldi or Waitrose or wherever, think about the sources of their food and how they make constructive decisions about where they buy it and how they buy it?
I like your question very much. Good-hearted organizations such as WWF have looked at this and concluded that it's hard to call. The benefits, as you said, for the people with livelihoods who otherwise wouldn't have livelihoods, it is that often water people, I've met American engineers say this, well, there was this transition in which this water was perhaps misused, but it's changed the whole opportunities available. So there are transitions take place. And this is a rather good one. But the demographic issue is also something. Are we aware that by the end of the century, there will be perhaps 11 billion people, and 4.3 will be in sub-Saharan Africa, such as in Kenya, and only 4.1 in Asia. The biggest demand, once you get into the really interesting stuff about water, you find that it's a Chinese population policy that has made us have a bit of a breathing space. There are 400 million people not there, and by the end of the century, another. So they've taken 1 billion people. That's quite a lot out of 11 billion, out of the demand. So please, it's not as straightforward as technology. It's highly political to do with demographic policy as well.
Did you want to come in, Declan?
At the opening of the presentation, someone mentioned stewardship, and I think that's very important. And there have been measures to look at the stewardship of water and to provide some indication or labelling about how effective the water management has been in particular products. And I think that is a good way to go. I think many people are aware of issues like air miles and emissions of greenhouse gases around products which are being flown in. They're far less aware of the issues around water, and that's something for us to do as a community, is to make people more aware that there are, of course, water externalities associated with products. We're catching up with the carbon people, and we will get there, but that involves us making people more aware, and also making the consumers more aware of the power that they have in terms of requesting that information from products and supermarkets.
Thank you. I'll go back to my old role.
Great question, Barbara. Yeah, there was someone back there in the yellow shirt on the end of the row. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentations. It's been a really interesting evening. My question is about the regulation aspect, and particularly on the international side. Who are the key players? That was really interesting to hear about China's policy and how that affects water scarcity. So who has this action? Who are the key players we need to convince to do something?
Declan?
Okay. I think it has, my understanding, again, it's slightly out of my comfort zone, but my understanding is that 20, 25 years ago, it was relatively clear-cut who some of the key players were in global finance and giving the go-ahead to projects and so on. And that was organizations like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other multilaterals who had the control over the purse strings and who had control over the environmental feasibility studies and impact assessments and so on. With the development of excuse me, the BRICS, China in particular, we now have an international finance and deregulation of international finance. We now have a much more messy situation with many organizations involved, financial brokers and money available from different sources and so on, particularly from the private sector. That means regulation and a role for particular organizations is far less clear-cut. And there is, from the global community perspective, I think, far less leverage on what is going on in certain countries around water infrastructure. So for a long time, for example, Ethiopia was heavily constrained in terms of being able to get agreement to go ahead with water infrastructure until it's developed, it's had growth, it's got an internal finance that means it's now in a position to be able to go ahead unilaterally to some extent with its decisions about water infrastructure. So we now have a much more messy system, which is difficult to see where the points of leverage are.
Could I?
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, my message is that your action is needed. Our action is needed. We need to do, in our case, we have a potential solution by not wasting food and eating sensibly. So if we're throwing a third away, obviously we're never going to have no waste, but if we could reduce that third to something much less, that would be, at the collective global scale, would be an immensely important contribution. So we need to do something ourselves as consumers, and then we need to think, what do we need? Stewardship. We need stewardship by farmers. Farmers manage 92% of the water. They're responsible for 25-30% of emissions. They are responsible for about 60% of the biodiversity impact, and they produce nutritious or not nutritious food. So we need to care about the farmers. We need to get that political message to make sure that our politicians have enough political space to do the right thing, which is, in fact, consider having higher priced food. But for the moment, I gave you enough evidence on what prices are doing. That mindset is in every country, poor country, rich country. In the United States, 76 billion a year go on food stamps. It is a welfare issue. And that means that this price signals, the wonderful market has got price signals which don't really help. We need to know that and act.
I do agree that I actually wonder if we're moving into an era where the consumer is in fact the regulator, and if we're not already, we need to get to that point where we are. I would mention perhaps the United Nations as well, though, as being, in terms of body, to your question. I think the United Nations is emerging more and more now in terms of things like the Sustainable Development Goals that they've set, which cover more than water, but actually water is right across those 17 goals if you really think about it. And okay, the member nations don't cover the whole of the world yet, but I think they're a body which we need to get behind and promote what they're saying.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm afraid it's almost 7 o'clock, so I'm going to go to you. Do you still have a question there? Yes.
I'm glad the panel and some of the members raised the issue of population and hydrology. I think the issue of population has been under-mentioned because a lot of the countries that are facing water security are also facing population boom, countries like Yemen, India, and all these places. And the other important thing is that a lot of the countries like Egypt and Nile, California, that use a lot of groundwater and irrigated water, there's a buildup of salt and saline in the farmed land, and ultimately the land will become non-productive, you see. So it's going to cause a lot of problem. And I've been to Syria, I've seen irrigations there, and like we mentioned, some of the issues about the civil war that came about because of this issue you see around that. Now, the other things I have in mind is that I don't want to take too much in, but I'm just wanted to talk about population, and I suddenly lost my thing. Yeah, deforestation. There's a wide destruction of forests, especially in places like Borneo and all that, for oil palm production, because mostly it's feeding the industrial world, you see. And soybean production in places like Brazil and all that to feed populations in China and animal feeds, you see.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up quickly.
Yeah, I'm just linking it with the hydrology bit, you see, and deforestation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just on the point about population, I think it's population plus. It's about population and changing lifestyle choices, especially of the growing middle class. It's not just about more mouths to feed, but the kinds of food that we feed into these mouths. So Tony has developed this really great sort of rule of thumb kind of figure of how, if you're a meat eater, you have a sort of water consumption about 5,000 liters during your day, and if you're a vegetarian, you have 2,500 liters of water consumption, all the water that goes into producing the food. So it's about the population and what the population demands in terms of their rights to a certain kind of lifestyle choice, a certain kind of lifestyle aspiration as well. And I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind, and not just the actual numbers of people on the planet.
Thanks, Naho. I think we're gonna finish there. I want to thank the panelists and just say that I think what I take away from this is that as individuals we have a responsibility, but we also have the potential to make choices that do have an impact. I think that's been made very clear to us that as consumers, as people who are privileged to live in an environment where we can raise our voices, that we shouldn't feel hopeless, we shouldn't feel that we don't have agency, and in fact we need to recognize the agency that we do have. So I want to thank the panelists for bringing these issues to light, and thank you all for coming.